All right, everyone. I think we're going to kick off and get started tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the ACCR webinar, Discourses of Climate Delay, the Carbon Capture of Our Politics. My name's Naomi Hogan from the Climate and Environment team at ACCR, and I'll be facilitating the discussion this evening. I'd like to start by acknowledging that for those of us joining from Australia, we are joining from unceded Aboriginal land. I'm joining from Awabakal country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and also to acknowledge the strength and leadership from First Nations people across this continent and the world over who are speaking up with passion, first-hand knowledge, and solutions for better outcomes for people and planet. Thank you everyone for popping your name and a comment in the chat there. Please feel free to keep that going so that we can get a feel for who's here this evening. Discourses of climate delay is the topic tonight. We know it's a critical time for climate action, and we know that every day is important. However, for some companies at the moment, the shift off fossil fuels pose a material threat to their business model. They want to see their fossil fuel expansion plans out and have devised ways to push a delay to action on climate change, where there are other companies that are genuinely doing all they can to innovate and draw down carbon emissions and limit climate change. So it's a complex time, and I'm really delighted tonight to introduce some speakers that can take us through some of the things that we're seeing in terms of delay, misinformation. It's really a webinar designed to share some context, examples, and clear tools to help us all identify when a company or a politician is using delay tactics. A few housekeeping points. We're going to hear from each of the three speakers, and then we'll have about 20 minutes at the end for questions. Please make use of the Q&A box on your screen. You can type in your questions at any time that you think of them, and I will endeavour to ask as many as I can at the end. So our first speaker tonight is Dr. William Lamb. William is based out of the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change. He's an interdisciplinary researcher based in Berlin. His work focuses on the linkages between human wellbeing and climate change mitigation. And he was a contributor to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report. William, thank you so much for joining us. I know you've got a busy schedule at the moment. I really enjoyed reading your paper. Can you talk us through some of your work and what your research found?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I am going to share a presentation now. I'm sure if you're sitting here today, you'll be aware that climate change is a topic is extremely surrounded by misinformation. And that misinformation tends to come in one of four different flavors. So climate denial, most importantly, so denial that climate change even exists, that it's human driven, that it has consequences. Ad hominem attacks, these are attacks on climate scientists, on climate communicators, and climate policymakers. A third area is climate impact skepticism. So this notion that actually climate change won't have such severe impacts, that we'll be able to deal with these in the future. And then a fourth topic is climate delay, which I'm going to talk about today. Now, there has been a flourishing of scholarship, very important scholarship around this topic, including the different strategies applied in different contexts, particularly in the Anglo-American context. And it's worth asking exactly why there is climate misinformation in the first place. So as Naomi said, there's really only a very limited role for fossil fuels in a Paris compliant energy system. So in an energy system that gets us to 1.5 or 2 degrees, most fossil reserves will have to stay buried in the ground. A significant portion of current fossil infrastructure will perhaps need to be retired early. And needless to say, no further fossil investments without CCS can really be made from this day onwards. So to survive, the fossil industry must find a way to legitimize its continued existence to the public and to policymakers. And misinformation really achieves this purpose. So what is climate delay specifically? Climate delay acknowledges climate change is happening. It acknowledges that it's going to have impacts and we should perhaps do something about it. But it nonetheless justifies inaction or inadequate efforts. And it does so mainly on normative grounds. So you'll hear perhaps, yes, climate change is a problem, but why should we tackle this problem? Won't the cost be too high? Are these really the right policies? Will these solutions actually work? So we're seeing here a shifting focus of doubt from attacks on climate science, climate communicators, and the downplaying of climate impacts to attacks on climate policies, whether they're feasible, desirable, or will have their intended outcomes. And indeed, climate delay seems to be becoming the dominant misinformation strategy. So this recent paper in Nature Scientific Reports looks at the prevalence of these claims around solutions won't work versus science. Science is unreliable or it's not happening. And around about 10 years ago, we've started to see a real uptick in these kind of arguments. And this is perhaps not the delay is replacing denial, but it's a broadening of this discourse base to target new audiences. So denial still exists, but we've got more delay on top of it. So it's targeting new audiences by bringing forward seemingly credible claims that don't directly attack the science. And those seem to work for certain individuals in certain parts of our population, which is why they're in use. So in our paper, Discourses of Climate Delay, we try to categorize these kind of arguments. And we think it comes in one of four flavors again. So basically, a climate delay argument would tend to answer no to one of these four central questions. First, is it our responsibility to take actions? Delay would argue that no, somebody else should take actions first. That responsibility isn't our problem. Second, are transformative changes actually necessary? A delay argument would rather push more non-transformative solutions that are less disruptive to the status quo. Third, is it actually desirable to mitigate climate change given the cost? Delay would answer that no, we should emphasize those downsides and perhaps it isn't worth it after all. And fourth, is it still possible to mitigate climate change? Delay would argue that no, it's not possible and we should perhaps surrender. So we have many subclaims within these different categories, and I'll just bring you through a few prominent examples. So individualism. Individuals and consumers are ultimately responsible for taking actions to address climate change. Now, this is perhaps more implicit most of the time. For example, when BP asks you to calculate your own carbon footprint and take little individual actions to deal with climate change. But it could also be explicit. For example, here in Yale University's response to a fossil fuel divestment campaign, our guiding principles are predicated on the idea that the consumption of fossil fuels, not production, is the root cause of the climate change problem. Targeting fossil fuel suppliers for divestment while ignoring the damage caused by consumers is misdirected. Of course, overlooking the fact that both consumers and producers are responsible for this problem and that perhaps producers deserve some policy attention. Now, whataboutism, an extremely widely used discourse. So our carbon footprint is very trivial compared to, for example, China. Therefore, it makes no sense for us to take action, at least until China does. You can use this in all kinds of contexts. In Germany, we often talk about being just 2% of global emissions. Why should we take action? You could cut it down to individual sectors. For example, transportation lobbies in some countries say, well, we're a small fraction. The focus should be on agriculture. Agricultural lobbies say, no, we're actually quite small as well. So the focus should be on transport. And we've documented those kind of conflicting and strange views in our paper. So what are the key points here? This is about directing attention away from fossil fuel interests towards those who have less agency to deal with this problem. It ignores historic responsibility, so this notion of whataboutism. It ignores the importance of leadership, the fact that we should perhaps take a leading role in addressing this problem, and it sets unrealistic conditions for taking action. So non-transformative solutions, of course, we have technological optimism, so the notion that we should rely on future technological innovations to deal with this problem with very limited interventions now, little policy action now. Or a more extreme version, that fossil fuels are actually part of this solution. This is particularly widely propagated by the natural gas industry, which sees itself as a bridging type fuel to a renewable future. Or that society will only respond to supportive and voluntary policies, and that restrictive measures will fail and should perhaps be abandoned. One of the key points, this is about offering seemingly credible solutions that exploit vague or narrow definitions of success. It connects to entrepreneurial right-of-center values, so really opposing restrictions, opposing market interventions, giving the impression that these things, that solutions will appear by themselves without too much effort. It draws attention away from measures that are most effective and most threatening, in particular near-term, immediate action, the kind of action that we actually need to deal with this problem. Emphasize the downsides. So I'm sure you've heard of this in Australia. Climate action will generate very large costs, particularly vulnerable members of our society will be burdened. There's a typical focus on jobs. A ban on fracking would cost the US over 7.5 million jobs, according to this advertisement. And again, a version of this that really tries to appeal to well-being itself. So drawing the link between fossil fuels and human well-being, and arguing that if we abandon these products, we will abandon our modern lives. We will condemn the global poor to hardship, and that the known risks to human well-being of constraining fossil fuels may actually be worse than the eventual risks from climate change. So here it's about focusing attention on the near-term costs of a transition, jobs, prosperity, social disruption, and it's downplaying or it's ignoring the injustices of the fossil economy, the long-term benefits of a transition, and of course, the climate impacts that will result from not dealing with this problem. Above all, it's about linking fossil fuels to human well-being. Now, final category, it's not possible to mitigate climate change and we should surrender. This comes in two flavors. One is that there are very serious social constraints to action, and any measure to reduce emissions would run against current ways of life, human nature, impossible to implement in a democratic society. Or from a more biophysical perspective, any mitigation actions we take are too little, too late, catastrophic climate change is already locked in. These identify real areas of carbon lock-in, social, economic, political, but they tend to reify the current state of things. They suggest that we can't change our current course. And rather than searching for solutions, they seem to generate a paralyzing sense of shock and resignation. So these are the discourses of climate delay. And if you're interested, there's a cartoon version developed and various other resources online that I can share afterwards. It's also been a nice new paper by one of your own natives, John Cook, who they develop a whole taxonomy that basically includes these delay type discourses, but also finds that alongside these, of course, we are using various other strategies that I mentioned at the beginning: climate denial, climate impact skepticism, ad hominem attacks. And it's important to note that these are all used interchangeably. Now, why should we care? These discourses argue on a normative basis. They seem to be more difficult to counter than denial. So rather than just going back to the science and asking and making fundamental points or refutations based on the science, it's much more difficult to approach climate delay arguments, because they argue, okay, what action should be taken, how fast, who bears responsibility. These require long-term, careful discussions. And it's not something that's very easy to do in our current sort of media and discursive landscape. They're compelling, they seem to contain grains of truth, and they can invite legitimate discussion, or they could be used to discourage climate action. So we need to be careful when identifying them about the intentions of those who are using them. Really, I'd like to emphasize that we should see ourselves as in the middle of this asymmetric war. So we've got scientists, engaged policymakers, activists. We're carefully talking about climate policy, climate pathways, and so forth. And then there's this counter movement that has very significant resources to craft and propagate these kind of discourses. So what should we do? We should call out delay arguments. We should give language to them. We should try and develop concise identification guides. The hope here is that if we expose people to these arguments while explaining their purpose, perhaps explaining why they could be wrong, then we inoculate the public against their future use. So people will when they hear an argument, they can see, I know what you're talking about. What aboutism there? What is actually your intention? So that's what I'd like to talk about as my input today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, William. That was really excellent and yes, very straightforward, which I enjoy. I've heard so many of those arguments. It's a pleasure to invite our next speaker to present, Marion Wilkinson, a multi-award winning journalist and author of several books, including The Carbon Club in 2020. Marion has served as a foreign correspondent in Washington, DC for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. She was a deputy editor and senior reporter at the SMH and an executive producer of the ABC's Four Corners program. Marion won a Walkley Award for Journalism and the Australia Museum's Eureka Prize for Environmental Journalism for her reporting on the rapid melt of Arctic sea ice. In 2018, she was inducted into the Australian Media Hall of Fame. Marion, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Your book, The Carbon Club, laid bare the close connection between the fossil fuel lobby and our politicians here in Australia. Can you talk us through what you're seeing play out now in Australia with respect to climate delay and what we might expect to see with the federal election approaching?
Thanks, Naomi. And I do have to say that listening to William, it was all a very familiar story. So, so I'd like to go through a bit of the politics and a bit of the interaction of business and politics in the current situation in Australia. So just last month, the president of the COP26 summit, Alex Sharma, announced, of course, that there was a new climate pact that had been signed in Glasgow that would keep alive the goal of 1.5. But for many delegates, the goal of holding global temperature rise to 1.5 was not so much alive as on life support. And that's because the emissions cuts promised by the nations in Glasgow would seriously overshoot 1.5 and put the world on track for global warming well above 2 degrees. And the delegates of COP26 knew this. As Sharma himself put it, collectively, we acknowledged that a gulf remains between short-term targets and what is needed to meet the Paris temperature goal. The Glasgow Climate Pact only kept 1.5 alive by pushing nations, including Australia, to come back to the negotiating table next year with more ambitious cuts that will drive down emissions faster over this critical decade. And that work, said Sharma, must start now. But the Glasgow Climate Pact has so far been brushed aside here in Australia, both by many in the fossil fuel industry and in politics. So this is what delay looks like. Just 10 days after the Glasgow Pact was agreed, as many of you know, the CEO of Woodside, Meg O'Neill, hit the go button on the $16 billion Scarborough Pluto LNG project in Western Australia. That project aims to produce and process 11 trillion cubic feet of gas for export to North Asia right through to 2050, when the world is supposed to hit net zero emissions. The total emissions from the projects, including the so-called Scope 3 emissions from customers for burning the gas, is estimated by Woodside to be around, I think, 878 million metric tonnes, but Dan might correct me on this, over its lifespan. That's a hell of a lot of emissions. While climate activists reacted with outrage at Woodside's announcement, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, was delighted, and he told a recent business gathering that he did a bit of a jig when he heard the Woodside board had approved the Scarborough development. Labor, too, has given the Scarborough project its enthusiastic backing. The state Labor Premier, Mark McGowan in WA, wants the outstanding approvals for the project pushed through, even as conservationists head to the courts to challenge these. Both state and federal governments have echoed Woodside's promises that several thousand jobs will be created in the early stages of the project. Royalties and taxes will flow throughout its operations. And in a telling statement of support, Labor's Federal Resources spokesperson, Madeleine King, described the project in these terms: that it was consistent with the global move towards decarbonisation, as well as Woodside's own commitment to net zero by 2050. Now, King's lines could have been written by Woodside, and that's not surprising. The company's latest climate strategy opens with the claim that Woodside supports the Paris Agreement and our natural gas can help reduce global emissions, a lot like what William was talking about just before. In all its marketing and publicity material around Scarborough, if you look at it, Meg O'Neill and Woodside have repeated the mantra that its giant LNG project is in line with the Paris Agreement and with the International Energy Agency's projections on gas demand to 2050. Now, I don't need to tell this audience that behind these marketing lines are a whole range of vexed questions for Woodside and its investors, including BHP shareholders. While Woodside's PR material presents various IEA graphs to show that the LNG trade will remain viable for decades to come, there's no actual references to the granular detail from the IEA's own net zero pathway report. Now, that report includes the finding that to reach the net zero goal by 2050 and avoid dangerous climate change, emissions from fossil fuels need to fall rapidly this decade, not increase. Yes, gas can be a very important bridging fuel between coal and renewables, but that bridge is extremely narrow. And unless gas producers and consumers can offset or bury their vast emissions, it's not going to be a long-term prospect. According to the IEA report, there will be less, not more gas demand by 2050, something like 55% less than today's levels. And as William mentioned, no new oil and gas fields being developed that haven't already been approved. So for both the government and the opposition federally in Australia, there is a stark message from the IEA report, and that is that all we hear about the income from gas and oil, this falls significantly if we actually take the net zero pathway, as does the promised tax revenue from these projects. As the gas analyst Peter Milne put it, not only may the LNG market be weaker than producers hope, but it also is likely to be much more competitive for companies like Woodside. But details like this are repeatedly disputed or downplayed, not only by Australia's fossil fuel industry, but by many of their supporters in the political parties and in government. And after a lot of research around this area, I think it's fundamentally because not a lot of these executives and politicians don't actually believe that the world will go through, or indeed needs to go through, the rapid energy transition that's envisaged in, for example, the IPCC 1.5 report. While many say they do accept the basic science of climate change, I think they don't accept the scientific case for the urgency of action. And that urgency, we're told, is necessary to reach the 1.5 goal, or at least as close as possible as we can get to it. When I wrote The Carbon Club, I explained why basically it took more than 2 decades in Australia for climate denialism to finally move to the fringes of Australian politics and business, which I think is where it sits today. Particularly after the Black Summer bushfires here, that move, that shift away from climate denialism was pretty apparent. But as climate denialism faded in Australia, delaying climate action has become much, much more visible as a strategy. And this isn't surprising. The fossil fuel industry is still extremely economically and politically powerful in Australia. Gas companies like Woodside, Santos, Chevron, coal companies like Whitehaven are still among the largest political donors here. but that only explains a small part of their influence. These companies and their lobbyists still largely control the public narrative on who creates wealth and prosperity in Australia, and particularly in regional Australia. And this comes through very clearly in the work of a friend of mine and one of Australia's leading social researchers, Rebecca Huntley, who's been tracking opinions on the fossil fuel industry and climate change for years in various electorates. In her work, she sets out this really interesting paradox for Australia right now. Since the summer bushfires, concerns about climate change have risen to a new high in Australia. And in particular, the belief that Australia needs to act more urgently. But at the same time, there remains a strong belief among voters that if Australia moves away from fossil fuel, it will mean an end to the mining industry in Australia and a massive loss of jobs and prosperity. And these jobs in her focus groups are often called real jobs, and that's how they're defined. There's little understanding that renewable energy itself actually creates more jobs in some particular mining industries. And there's a grossly inflated view of how many jobs are actually created in the fossil fuel industry. Now, Huntley describes this kind of belief pattern that she's seeing in these focus groups, a kind of culture capture, a hold on the Australian psyche that makes it hard for many Australians to imagine a prosperous and secure future without a central role for fossil fuels. So while there might be a desire to replace fossil fuels, a lot of voters can't actually see the pathway whereby we can do this. Now, these views are obviously partly the result of the massive PR campaigns and lobbying campaigns by the fossil fuel industry, some of which William displayed in his slides. But as Huntley puts it, it's also the net result of decades of politicians lauding the fossil fuel industry publicly, but at the same time often trashing the capacity and potential of the renewable energy industry. I think this is now becoming much more acute since the Paris Agreement, which finally did call for that rapid transition to clean energy, and the 1.5 degree IPCC report that followed. Since then, there's been triggered these huge fears of energy insecurity in Australia that get exploited by the industry and politicians at election time. And you only have to look at the last federal election in 2019 to see that energy insecurity is one of the most effective arguments for those who want to block and back the case for delay and the case for the expansion of the gas and coal industries. And I think this will be a big theme that will be played out in the 2022 election. The government clearly sees it as a way of wedging Labor on this issue. And this was very interesting in the way that Energy Minister Angus Taylor recently honed this argument in a speech he gave to the Australian Financial Review Energy Summit. It was a kind of strange speech. It was a highly undiplomatic speech because it was just before he left for the Glasgow Climate Conference with Morrison, and he launched a savage attack on Boris Johnson's climate policy. And he did this by tying it to the energy crisis in Britain. And what Taylor said was, this is what happens if policymakers and industry take reliability and affordability for granted in the energy market. And he warned the executives present at this energy summit that in the UK, a cold, hard winter, as he described it, beckons. And he went on to say that amongst the miseries facing Britain as a result of this, caused, as he believed, by this too rapid transition to clean energy, People now have to deal with a gut-wrenching choice: to heat or to eat. Those were his words. Now you can see how this argument of energy security is now being honed in Australia as we, look at what's happening in Europe. And this message, I think, is being taken up with gusto by many in the fossil fuel industry. Australia's plan, which was released, of course, just before Glasgow, makes this energy security issue a real factor in the backing of the coal and gas industry. And while the fine print of the plan actually does admit that Australia's coal industry will decline, especially its coal exports, it sticks to the theme that our gas industry is going to expand for decades to come. And it's going to do this essentially on the back of CCS technologies of the future, carbon capture and storage on a massive scale. Now, that raises a lot of questions amongst both climate scientists and climate activists, and in fact, economists and other business leaders, because as we know, CCS is still economically unproven, but it's now become an absolutely central focus of the gas industry and the government, and for that matter, the opposition in Australia. And the reason is that it's one of the few cards that the gas industry has to play when they say they have a future under the Paris Agreement. It's why, for example, Santos used their latest CCS proposal to put it on display in Glasgow at the Australian stand. It just shows how absolutely vital this is. And I think for a lot of Australians, it's unpicking how much CCS is just really an excuse for delay and how much it will be useful in the technologies of the future that climate scientists are trying to unpick at the moment. But I just want to wrap up by saying that for all those who are actively now pushing the case for delay in Australia, for the first time in a very long time, I think we are seeing the pressure coming the other way. You look at what the state governments are doing, especially in Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia, Tasmania. There is a big push on to actually move much faster in the energy transition. You see companies like Fortescue moving very quickly, trying to move in the area of green hydrogen. You look at Sun Cable massively expanding the renewable energy industry, and that is marrying up with what a lot of our trading partners and even China is doing. And that indicates to me that the arguments of delay, while in the short term they're having a fair bit of impact, in the longer term they're not really going to play out, I think, as some in the fossil fuel industry expect. So I'll leave you just with this thought that over the last 2 decades that I reported on the climate and energy issues, the kind of energy transition that is needed to meet the climate crisis was dismissed by Australian politicians, business leaders, fossil fuel lobbyists, skeptic think tanks, and indeed many in the Canberra press gallery. And it was seen as unimaginable at best and economy wrecking at worst. Now, that was the gospel of the time. But the most important discovery I made actually writing my book was that almost every prediction made by many of the leaders in these areas about the energy transition was wrong. Why was that? Because they never understood the scientific reality of climate change and what it would do. And it was one very wise financial executive who put to me a few years ago that this change that is happening will ultimately be inevitable, because he said as a financial investor, merchant banker, advisor, he asked himself one question: am I going to defeat science? And when you thought about it long enough, the answer was no, I'm not going to defeat science. And ultimately, I think that's what's going to happen here.
Thank you so much, Marion. I feel like that was a roller coaster ride of a lot of food for thought, and love your positive ending there. Dan, I'll pass over to you, our final speaker tonight. He is our Director of Climate and Environment here at ACCR. And Dan, you're one of the few people I know who have been systematically reviewing the impact of the fossil fuel lobby here in Australia and why it matters for policy and corporate leadership. Are you able to provide us some examples of what you've noticed through your research and what we might expect to see into the future?
Thanks, Naomi. Yes, I am. And it was difficult to actually whittle down the number of examples that we have of the discourses of climate delay. So I'm going to share my screen and just give me the thumbs up, Naomi, when you see that. Great. This is just to provide a bit of context. So this is a chart of Australia's energy exports over the last 10 years. So these are billions of dollars, and that puts it into context. So that's coal, gas and oil, and puts it into context about the influence of these industries over government, given the size of the industry. And as Marion said before, we'll talk a bit about jobs later, but that's in terms of export dollars. As William displayed earlier, this is his amazing chart of the discourses of climate delay. The one on the left, what William has described as surrender, we don't see too much of in Australia. So I don't actually have any examples of that, but I certainly do have examples of the other three major categories. So let's start with redirecting responsibility. And this is one that William referred to earlier. This is BP's carbon footprint, which is still active on its website, and was probably the first of I think BP was the first of the oil majors to encourage individuals to take responsibility for their own carbon footprint. And we've got a more current version of that from a company called Origin Energy, which is both a gas company and an electricity generator. It launched a campaign earlier this year called the 90 Ways of Change to reduce your personal footprint on the world, not just on emissions, but also on water and the environment generally. It included suggestions like not washing your clothes, turning the lights off, etc. It's the evolution of the carbon footprint, if you like. So moving on to whataboutism. So this is a conversation between a radio host, Neil Mitchell, and Prime Minister Scott Morrison, where he said, as you referred to earlier, in a German context, William, where Prime Minister Scott Morrison said we're around 1% of global emissions, essentially saying we can't act until China and India does. Another version, so moving on to the next redirecting responsibility of the free rider excuse. Matt Canavan, who's a senator in the federal parliament, it was hard to choose which tweet to actually post on this, but this is a regular occurrence from Matt Canavan, suggesting that if we shut down our industries, then China will just steal all the jobs in industry. And the next one, the free rider excuse, I'm going to play an audio clip from Ian McFarlane, who's the CEO of the Queensland Resources Council. So that's the peak lobby group in Queensland representing the coal and gas industries. Just give me a thumbs up that you hear them. Great.
Yeah, look, Australia sets targets and meets them and exceeds them. And in terms of our emissions on a global scale, we are tiny compared to countries like China and India and the US. The reality is that...
Not if you tie in the emissions then of the use of the coal in that country.
Not our decision to burn the coal. It's other countries' decisions. And Australia is a sovereign nation, and other countries are sovereign nations. They make decisions and then they create a demand, and we satisfy that demand.
That came from an interview Ian McFarlane gave about a week ago or 2 weeks ago. And we will share that link later on. But that was, I I think he hit about 7 or 8 of the discourses of climate delay in one single interview. So it was difficult to choose which clip to post. So moving on to pushing non-transformative solutions. As Marion referred to earlier, this is the diorama that Santos had at the Australia Pavilion at COP26. It was essentially a showcase of what carbon capture and storage can do by turning, blue gas bubbles into green gas bubbles. This is a project that has been widely supported by the federal government, including Angus Taylor, the Energy and Emissions Reduction Minister. Again, another version of the non-transformative solutions, all talk, little action. This is an ad campaign from Woodside Energy that has run across both social media, billboards, bus stops, you name it. The claim there is they've zeroed in on net zero emissions. And as Marion referred to earlier, they've just signed off on a $16 billion new gas project, which doesn't sound to me like a net zero emissions pathway. Fossil fuel solutionism is probably the most common one that we see in the Australian context. And these are 2 ads from the gas industry. So APPEA, the Petroleum Production Exploration Association. This is a full-page ad that APPEA ran across print media about 2 weeks ago. And the ad there on the right, renewables supported by natural gas. You could also argue that gas bottle is holding the solar panel back, but that's a slightly different take. That's currently being run across social media as we speak. Again, another version of the non-transformative solutions, no sticks, just carrots. Again, the same interview with Prime Minister Scott Morrison with Neil Mitchell on 3AW, 6 weeks ago. This last phrase here where he talks about technology, not taxes, choices, not mandates. So essentially saying that, or implying that the Labor Party will tax their way to reduce emissions, whereas his government will not. That comes in the form of choices, not mandates. So moving on to emphasising the downsides. This is a difficult one there's few examples of policy perfectionism, but this is probably the best one there is, to be honest. So this is 2019. The Western Australian Environmental Protection Agency put out draft guidelines proposing that new carbon intensive projects would be required to offset their emissions. Woodside, given its plans, objected to these guidelines and subsequently ran an ad campaign across TV, radio, and print. That's the print ad there, and that's the online ad, suggesting that the policy is not good enough and we should just scrap it altogether. And that's essentially a week later. That is essentially what happened. So the gas industry won that battle. Appealing to well-being is probably another of the most common themes that we see in the Australian context. This is one of the original appeals to well-being from Peabody Energy, who is one of the significant coal producer in Australia, obviously referring to developing countries needing coal to develop. And the modern version of that looks like this. So again, Matt Canavan suggesting that what we need to provide, cheap coal and gas, supposedly, to lift people out of poverty. And Michelle Manouk published an op-ed in the Financial Times last month at the end of COP26, suggesting that coal is required to lift people out of poverty. It is an op-ed that is well worth a read. The World Coal Association, BHP, left in 2018 following some advocacy from ACCR, but a number of Australian companies remain members, including Horizon, Intertech, Pivot, Orica, Whitehaven Coal, etc. So still a fairly big Australian presence, and Michelle Manouk is an Australian at the World Coal Association. This is the latest version of the coal industry's appeal to well-being. This is a current ad campaign that Glencore is running across the Hunter Valley. So Naomi's hometown, this is the local tram, essentially advertising that mining matters. And you'll note that the pictures there refer to the conveniences of modern day life, including laptops and stethoscopes. The Hunter Valley is a coal mining region. They don't produce really any other minerals out of the Hunter Valley. So to suggest to a coal mining community that mining matters, they're really trying to conflate the conveniences of modern life with coal mining. Again, it was hard to limit the number of examples of appealing to well-being, but this is what we call an advertorial in the Courier Mail a few months ago, so in May earlier this year, at the height of the pandemic, where the oil and gas industry put out a media release saying these are all the things that oil and gas provide in your everyday life, including hand sanitizer. And it's a pretty stark example of that appeal to well-being, that we can't live without them. Appealing to social justice is another variation that we see semi-regularly. This is our Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce tweeting a few months ago at the height of winter, suggesting that people can't afford to heat their homes and they need fossil fuels to do so. So that's not the first time he's kind of implied that. I've seen Facebook posts and tweets from Barnaby before on that same matter. So again, appealing to social justice. That's on the left there. Sorry about the lack of clarity on that image, but that's a full-page ad that Brighter, which is a subsidiary of Appia, is running across Western Australian newspapers at the moment. I know what they say across the top, but it is clearer when you look at it on the slide deck. They talk about jobs, cleaner energy, reliability, and energy security. And I'm going to play the audio ad that they're currently running across radio and Spotify at the moment.
Natural gas, a reliable, cleaner source of energy that fuels all of our lives. The natural gas industry supports tens of thousands of jobs across Australia, jobs that are the lifeblood of our suburbs, regions and small businesses. Here's something else you might not know about natural gas.
Australia's natural gas industry provides cleaner, reliable energy for everyday needs like cooking, heating and electricity. That's why the Australian natural gas industry puts Australia first to meet these needs. Australia's gas continues to power Australian homes and industry. Australia's natural gas supply is secure and will remain secure.
Brighter with natural gas, naturally part of Aussie life. Google Brighter with natural gas, authorised by S Brown for AP Limited, Melbourne.
Just to give you an idea, these are the two major fossil fuel lobbies, or national ones at least, the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association and the Minerals Council of Australia. You can see over the last 3 years, they've significantly increased spending on marketing. It's gone from a fraction of their overall expenses in 2018 to quite a significant number in 2020. And we're hoping to get the 2021 numbers hopefully this week or next. In terms of the year ahead, I'm very conscious of time, Naomi, and I can see your eyes looking at me, but what do we expect to see? Well, this is what we expect to see from government. So looking at all talk, little action, essentially saying that we're meeting and beating our targets. Both optimism and the no sticks, just carrots is that phrase of technology, not taxes. Again, no sticks, just carrots is choices, not mandates, and that's specifically in relation to the electric vehicle policy. And at the moment, the federal government is running these ads across social media, television, radio, suggesting that we're all about positive energy. I would play the clip, but we are running short on time. And finally, the year ahead in terms of the industry associations. So this is the response that the Minerals Council and Appia gave to Labor's policy last week, essentially threatening in a way that Labor needs to support business as usual, and that we can't move faster than what what the commercial reality is, whatever that may mean. And on the right there, that's the Queensland Resources Council, and they're currently pushing an argument that Australian coal should be the last coal to be ever dug out of the ground anywhere in the world because we have the cleanest coal. And on that, I'll stop sharing, and hopefully we can have a brief discussion with the time that we have remaining.
No worries, Dan. Thank you. Let's see how we go. We might run over a little bit. Hopefully people can stay on because I found all those talks really informative. We've had a few questions come through, and I've also had a few questions before tonight on a similar theme, probably mostly for you, Marion and William, around Saffron asks around the antidote to culture capture and examples of climate narratives that are effective at getting people past that idea that we're going to lose those jobs. Wondering if you could share an example of when you've been able to get through the delay, and you as well, William, in terms of being able to shift the narrative successfully? What examples do you have?
One of the more transformative interactions I've had on this was that I was in a public talk earlier this year before lockdown, and this issue came up about if we move too fast, none of this technology is really up to speed, that kind of thing. And fortunately, I suppose one of the people on the panel was Mike Cannon-Brookes, who, as you know, is part of the Sun Cable investments and quite a number of other renewable energy investments. And I thought the interesting thing about how he discussed the issue was to actually try and, if you like, meet it head to head, sort of at an executive level. And I think one of the issues, if I can give an example with the Woodside Scarborough project, one of the clever things Woodside's doing is to say we can back up gas for the WA electricity grid, and there's also an implication that it'll back up the eastern grid somehow as well. But if you look at that and you break it down, it's just not accurate. The reality is that gas, as we know, is being priced out of the system, out of the electricity grid, because it's so expensive. And I do think one of the useful things for people in this space is to actually get people like the executives from the Australian energy market operator, get some of the executives from the new energy companies who are putting together the battery solutions to firm up renewable energy, especially like with the recent proposal in Victoria, and have them speak and have their voices heard. Because I think when you do listen to those executives who are deeply amongst the solution or deeply working in the solutions, the narrative really changes and their arguments become so much more convincing, for example, than me or you trying to do it. But I think they also are really, in fact, I think going back to that discussion with Cannon-Brookes, it was also really exciting that the people who were listening to that forum were genuinely excited by the possibility of the speed of change. And I think that changing that narrative that is so controlled by the fossil fuel industry at the moment. And when I saw Dan's slides tonight, I thought, oh my God, it's much more pervasive than I thought. But I think that's a really, really important issue, because at the end of the day, countries will turn away from our fossil fuel industry. Our trading partners will turn away whether we like it or not, and with it will go those jobs.
Thank you. Did you want to add, William?
Yeah, I'm in two minds about how to respond to these kind of arguments. So on the what's working against us? One is that, like Jeremy says in the chat, they have just incredible resources to propagate this kind of thing. There are millions and millions of dollars just being spent in Australia alone to cultivate these advertisement campaigns, and there's simply no way that we could organize and respond to that without having a similar level of resource, which doesn't seem feasible. A second issue is, do you really want to draw attention to those discourses? So in responding to them specifically, you draw attention to them, and the worst case scenario is that you end up backing yourself into a corner and like arguing against specific jobs in a specific industry, and really having this a perspective that can be even further attacked and even further vilified. by those interest groups. So I think the strategy is actually to respond in general and not in specifics. And the typology gives a sense of how you might do that. So is it our responsibility to take actions? I think we need to cultivate a discourse of responsibility in our different countries and contexts. So we have an ethical responsibility to address this problem. There are very severe climate impacts going to be coming upon us and coming upon disadvantaged communities, et cetera, and various activist groups are already doing this, and we should support them in doing that. And climate scientists and climate communicators can try to think about how they can cleverly support each other and so forth. A second area, are transformative changes necessary? We need to really upgrade the public conversation on what policies and what actions and measures have a transformative impact. I think there's probably a very, very strong role for media in that conversation, and having a good expert-driven discourse. Also more bottom-up things like climate, like these forums where people discuss solutions and make recommendations and so forth. I think these are quite promising, and they tend to come out with very ambitious proposals, in fact. A third area, so is it desirable to mitigate climate change? I think we need to emphasize the upsides in general of mitigating climate change. We need to emphasize that this means new jobs, good jobs. It means lowered impacts on on human health from air pollution, safer cities, clean air for our children, et cetera, et cetera. And I think these points should be repeated again and again and again in all sorts of contexts and ways. And the good news is that we have the science on our side for all of this stuff, right? So scientists can say these things, but also everyday people and individuals can read the science and understand and try to propagate those as well. And third and finally, is it possible to mitigate climate change? It is possible. We should continue repeating this as much as possible. Every degree matters. If we don't make 2 degrees, we should go for 2.1. If we don't make 2.1, we should go for 2.2. So the impacts just get worse and worse and worse, and we should stabilize at any temperature that we can. And the good news is, of course, there's this literature emerging on tipping points and cascading effects of climate damages. The science is very fresh there, and as far as we know, actually, when we stop releasing CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, climate change stops. So we can solve this problem. We know what policies will solve this problem. We know what technologies will solve this problem. We need to just talk about that all the time. So I think in the end, I would say don't respond to the arguments specifically, don't draw attention to them, but try to be clever about the things we are saying in public and try to target these 4 areas.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate how your framework provides not only a clue for how we can figure out if they are delaying, but also what we can use to promote in our positive language to push back. So thank you. Dan, I know you answered it in the chat there, but I wondered if we could spend a few more minutes for those that can stay online to talk through, if you wanted to talk a little bit to the question around investors and the role that industry does play, and whether we're seeing a general understanding of just how influential these lobby groups can be in delaying climate action.
Look, I don't think it's widely understood. I don't think most investors see it as pervasive as we do. It's clear. So our approach to date has involved asking companies to publish reviews of their industry associations and to essentially review, the advocacy of an industry association versus the company's own policy. More often than not, those reviews turn up with blanks, basically to say that everything's fine, everything's aligned. So those reviews are not doing the job. The negative advocacy continues, and it's just evolved into something more nuanced, more sophisticated. So investors really need to escalate the issue of lobbying. And we've said this about BHP in the past, that a company like BHP, its lobbying footprint is arguably bigger than its own emissions footprint. And its influence over Australian climate and energy policy is so large that it dwarfs its own emissions footprint. So that's how big an issue it is. And for me, this is, is arguably it is a more important issue than the decarbonisation one, because it is the block that stops decarbonisation from happening. I would encourage all investors to escalate as much as possible and really prioritise their engagement on lobbying as much as they possibly can.
Thank you. And probably a final point here, just to go to the note that Jeremy mentioned there around the big clean, able to support research campaigns. Are there examples where we could see a positive lobbying campaign? Can we actually see this new energy and funding support for renewable industries to start having an influence on the discourse as well? I don't know if William, you've seen that internationally, where you've seen the support of the research that you're doing or interest there in shifting those narratives?
To me, it doesn't sound like a very promising strategy for a number of reasons. One is that I think they simply don't have the resources to compete with the fossil fuel capital right now. It's these are emerging technologies. They are emerging very fast. However, another issue is they haven't built up this cultural capital that Marian was talking about. So they don't have this strong link to these notions of what jobs are, what energy security is, all that kind of stuff. That takes a really long time to build up. And I think, now is a good time to start with that. But it's perhaps too late for that strategy to have an impact in the short term. And then finally, I probably think that we just need to take more money out of politics rather than have lobbying on either side. I think that would be the best overall solution.
Thank you. Marion, do you have closing thoughts along those lines?
I do think the point that William just made then about the money is absolutely critical, about the amount of money, especially from third parties in election campaigns. And I was particularly curious to see the slide that Dan had on Glencore's advertising campaign in Newcastle, because I've came across them so many times as an incredibly aggressive player in Australian politics on the coal issue. And I was wondering whether Dan might be able to tell me whether he thinks the current advertising will continue through to the federal election, that the advertising that's going on at the moment by Glencore.
Look, it seems that way. And look, there's absolutely no shortage, as Naomi's aware, there's no shortage of fossil fuel advertising online at the moment, or on our TV and radio. It is definitely more nuanced. It's not, they're not saying that, tear up the Paris Agreement type stuff. That Glencore advertising is very subtle. But it's, I've raised it with a handful of Glencore investors already to try and get an explanation why they're doing that. They would argue that they employ, X thousand people in the Hunter, and I imagine that's why they do it. But look, that's
not because there's 2 seats in play in the Hunter Valley of the federal election.
Oh, you said that, Marion, not me. That's something for us to watch, particularly over the next, the next 4 to 5 months in the lead up to an election, and if we can try and limit or constrain the influence of that advertising, then we'll do everything we can to do that.
Fascinating. Yeah. Well, I guess my closing thoughts are, yes, there is a huge way to go in Australia on all this, and I do think one of the pressures we can put on politicians, on our local members, as apart from what investors can do for their companies, but in the actual political discourse that we have at election time, is trying to do this thing about enforcing controls on spending by fossil fuel companies, any companies actually, in elections, keeping donations minimal and keeping the advertising campaigns of these third parties far more under control, both at election time, but also truth in advertising during non-election periods as well.
Thank you. Dan, closing comments from you there?
Oh, look, it's one I've said to our own team, Naomi. It's when you think about the reasons why we haven't had climate action in this country or serious climate policy, it's yes, people like Tony Abbott and Angus Taylor and Scott Morrison are partly to blame, but those who are mostly to blame are the fossil fuel companies, and that's the reality of it.
Well, we're certainly planning a lot more work in this space going forward. We encourage everyone to jump onto our website. You can go and sign up to get newsletters there, jump on our socials and follow us there. We will be planning more reports and work on this into the new year and for 2022. So thank you all very much for coming tonight. Thank you so much to our speakers for giving up your time to share your insights and research. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone for attending, and we shall see you soon. Look out for an email from us with the recording from tonight. It will also be up on YouTube. Thank you.